I'm Rita Sargentopoulos and welcome to KARE 11 Extras. Today we're talking about birds. There has been a rapid decline of birds in our state, but hope is not lost. We set out to learn which birds are most at risk, why, and the creative ways that many organizations are using to solve the problem.
Consider yourself lucky to live here. Our access to nature gives us access to birds, and birds, well, let me tell you about the birds. Other than being just another pretty feather, they can improve our mental health. True story, listening to birds can help relieve stress and anxiety. It's science. They're darn good at pest control and seed dispersal. They're food for us, and not to mention, they provide the economic benefits of hunting and bird watching. So, in conclusion, birds are great. There's just one problem.
People have been making these observations for decades. It's like, just seems like there are fewer birds than there were when we were growing up.
Backing up those observations, the 2025 State of the Birds Report. It shows about a third of all American bird species are of high or moderate concern due to low populations, declining trends, or other threats.
In Minnesota, we see sort of three groups of birds that are on this national watch list species.
Dale Gentry with the Audubon Society says first are birds that live in Minnesota year-round, like the greater prairie chicken and evening grosbeak. Category 2 are birds that breed in Minnesota, like the bobolink, field sparrow, and chimney swift. And then there are the shorebirds, the ones who just use Minnesota as a stopover on their migration route. They winter in the tropics and they breed way up north in the Arctic.
They fly, hop, skip, and a jump about 200-300 miles at a time, and then they stop for a couple of days, rest and refuel in the same way that we stop at a rest area on our way up to Duluth. And so they need these healthy habitats intermediate along the way.
The report found that birds that rely on grasslands or wetlands are most in danger. Grassland birds are in steep decline, losing more than 50% of their populations in the last 50 years. And one category of birds that used to be a bright spot, waterfowl, have now also seen declines. So, what gives?
The biggest driving factor for all these guilds of species comes down to habitat, right? And do they have the habitats that they need to basically reproduce and survive?
The Nature Conservancy is also paying close attention to the problem.
In the last decade or so, we've been losing, 1 to 2 million acres of grassland a year in some parts of like the northern Great Plains area, in western Minnesota in particular.
And drought in the prairie pothole region is drying up wetlands. But it's not just losing habitat, it's the quality of the habitat that remains. Invasive species, pollution, land mismanagement, there are many factors that play into this. But there is good news.
We work with landowners from Alaska down to Mexico doing things like, buying habitat and moving it into public ownership.
Groups like Ducks Unlimited are working to restore wetlands, grasslands, and forests. Last year alone, they completed 60 conservation projects in Minnesota, like this one in Jackson County. The Nature Conservancy and Audubon Society are doing similar work, each of them getting creative and involving landowners who want to be part of the solution.
I do feel deeply about leaving this place better than I found it.
Matt Meyer owns Thousand Hills Beef. He's part of the Audubon's conservation ranching program. How he raises and grazes his cattle is actually restoring bird habitat.
What we're trying to do is mimic nature. So everything we're doing, like in moving the cattle daily and having them bunched up and grazing tightly, mimics how bison were grazing for thousands and thousands of years.
Matt moves his herds every day to make sure the grass isn't grazed to the ground, providing cover for birds. He stays out of nesting areas and makes sure there's a diversity of plants, which is healthier for the animals and the soil. In return, the birds provide pest control, so he doesn't have to use chemicals on his ranch.
And that's what nature designed, is that all these animals and birds and wildlife would all be working together to thrive.
And it's working. But maybe you're thinking, why should I care? Because it really does affect all of us.
The places that are providing habitat for birds also do things like store carbon and provide pollination services and provide water quality benefits and even flood storage. What is good for birds is also good for people.
Coming up, Dale Gentry with the Audubon Society joins us in studio to answer more of your questions and to give us some tips about how we can help the birds, even in our own backyards. Welcome back. We're talking about the rapid decline of birds all across the country and how we in Minnesota are specifically affected. And we want to give you some ideas on how you can help be part of the solution. Joining us now is Dale Gentry, Director of Conservation for Audubon Upper Mississippi River. Dale, thanks for being here today. We appreciate it.
Of course, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so we learned a little bit from you in the story, but we want to talk about this problem of the declining birds. It's actually not something new. In 2019, there was a study that said we have lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. Yeah. It's something that you have noticed here in Minnesota, is that right?
It has, yeah. Myself and everyone else that pays attention to birds, it seems like there are fewer than there used to be. And it's interesting now to have the data and the fine details about which groups of birds are going in different directions. But yeah, it's been something people have really remarked on for a number of years. And now we know where we need to work.
Why should we care, though? If someone's like, I don't pay attention to birds, I don't go out there and go birding, but you guys say something all the time that I really like, is what's good for birds is good for people. Yeah. Explain that.
It's true. Well, I mean, Audubon is a bird conservation organization, but it's not very hard to argue that what we're doing for birds is going to benefit all of humanity and all of society, because we are all dependent on the same thing that birds are: healthy places to live, clean water, clean air. We all love to go out and recreate in the habitats that the birds are dependent on. And so the work that we're putting into making sure these bird populations are healthy is going to trickle down in so many different ways that make people's lives better.
And a lot of the habitats do things like they remove carbon from the air, or they store flood water. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we work in the Mississippi River, of course, Minnesota's wetlands and grasslands. All of those places are in very sometimes subtle ways that we don't realize, storing water and making our floods not so intense, and storing carbon and helping to mitigate climate concerns, and just benefiting other forms of wildlife in addition to birds. So what we're investing for birds is really having all kinds of benefits across our society and all of the environment.
You mentioned wetlands and grasslands. Those are the issues that we're seeing the most decline in habitat. Why is that, and what can we do?
Yeah, it's a really important question. There are a lot of different components to this, but really what we're seeing in many cases is that the habitats that are of use to us, especially for farming, are those that we're competing with for habitat for birds. And so grassland birds that needed the historic prairies with bison roaming, and all of the North America's grasslands really being defined by this prairie that extended from Canada down to Texas, is also fantastic for farmland. And so as we farm it in the Midwest, which is so important to our culture and to our well-being, we want to make sure that the farming we're doing is also compatible with diversity as well.
And with we talked about in the story with the weather changes and droughts, that's affecting things too. Mm-hmm. So you guys do a lot of conservation and you work with a lot of different agencies. Yep. Tell us what kind of things you are doing in the conservation world and who you're working with.
Yeah, sure. So we are, as you said, involved in lots of different ways. We've got private lands focus and public lands focus. And so when we're working with private lands, we want to make sure that the people that are landowners have the tools they need to make sure that the lands that they manage are healthy for birds and healthy for themselves. And so we've got projects to work with grass-fed beef producers and maple syrup producers and people that have hunting land and forest land that they want to manage for birds. We give them the tools they need, we give them financial assistance when we can, and a lot of that's done with partnerships with Minnesota DNR, Natural Resources Conservation Service, with funding from the state of Minnesota. In Minnesota, we are really fortunate to have some of the best funding around the country that supports environment and conservation, because Minnesotans are so connected to the land and really care about all of those resources. So the Outdoor Heritage Fund and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, along with other funding, really enable us to do a lot of this work.
A lot of private funding as well, too, people who care.
A lot of private funding, yeah. People care about birds. In fact, 1 in 3 people in North America raise their hands and say, I am a bird watcher, I care about birds, I'm paying attention to what shows up at my feeder. And those people support Audubon and other partners so that we can do our work.
And the other things that you're doing, like you maybe go in and take out invasive species in forests or wetlands or grasslands, is that true?
Yep. Yeah, that's what we have expertise in, what birds need and what a healthy habitat looks like. And so we go in and manage cattails and marshes and buckthorn and forests. And we are making sure that the habitat is of high quality so that when birds show up, the table is set for them. They've got a place to build a nest. They've got plenty of food. They're not having to compete with invasive species that really really makes those habitats of poorer quality.
We talked a little bit about the ranching in the story, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the ranching coming up in our next segment. But you mentioned maple syrup. So how are maple syrup farmers helping with the birds?
It's an interesting question, because people think, well, it's a forest, isn't it good for birds? And it is, but in many cases you got different levels of good. And so what we found is that a lot of people that manage a forest for maple syrup, they want just maple trees there. And so by managing for just mature maple trees, you've got a forest that suddenly lacks some of the diversity of age of trees and the diversity of species of trees. And so what we say is, let's continue to focus on sugar maple, but let's add in a small percentage of a few other species of trees with a few younger trees and shrubs, and that makes a remarkable difference for birds. And so this program's really thriving in New England, where so much sugar maple is produced, so successful there that the Forest Service is helping us bring it to Minnesota and Wisconsin so that we can begin to recognize maple syrup farmers in our region as well.
All right, finally, what can we do if we want to help just sitting at our home?
So glad you asked, because there's so much we can do, right? So think about your home is the first place to go. Make sure that birds can see your windows, that they're not colliding with them by putting decals on windows, turning off the lights, participating in the lights out program so that during migration birds aren't attracted to the light that's coming through your windows. Keeping cats indoors can make a big difference, because cats, as lovely as they are like to eat birds and kill them. And then just making sure that the plants that you're planting are native plants that are going to produce an abundance of food and shelter for the birds that come to your yard. So making your yard and your house a bird-friendly place is great. Conservation through your consumer practices, right? So buy shade-grown coffee, buy bird-friendly beef, buy bird-friendly maple syrup. Think about your carbon footprint and all of the environmental consequences of what we buy. And what you can find is that some things you buy are going to do really a lot of good and can benefit the world. And when we find those opportunities, let's take advantage of them.
Awesome.
And the last thing I really encourage people to do is just get to know your birds. I don't know anybody that doesn't know their birds, that doesn't care about them. And so when people spend time taking kids on bird walks or taking their neighbor and introducing them to the birds in their neighborhood, they eventually become to care for those deeply and get inspired to take action. So
awesome.
There's so many opportunities.
Absolutely. Dale Gentry, Audubon Society, thank you so very much. We appreciate it. All right, next up, we talk with Matt Meyer from Thousand Hills Beef about the conservation ranching program we were just talking about, and more about the regenerative agriculture that he and his family have been practicing for decades on his ranch. Welcome back. We've been talking about a decline of birds in our state and some solutions that folks are working on. And one of those people willingly wanting to be part of the solution is Matt Meyer, owner of Thousand Hills Beef. Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Happy to be with you.
So we were talking earlier in the show about the conservation ranching program and how you willingly were a part of this. But this is something you guys have been doing on your farm for decades. This is nothing new to you. Explain exactly what kind of agriculture you're involved in.
Yeah, well, the term for it is regenerative agriculture. Although when we started our practices, there wasn't a term for it. Now it now encompasses very well what we're doing in trying to regenerate soil and wildlife habitat and help provide cover for pollinators and birds and other wildlife. And really, regenerative agriculture boils down to wanting to help nature thrive by mimicking nature and trying not to kill things, but rather create a real diverse environment that gives the habitat for the wildlife that we're talking about.
One of the things that you've learned along the way is the more diverse the plants are, the more diverse the soil is, and it's actually better for the animals as well. Is that the case?
Yeah, it's amazing. Diversity seems to be good everywhere, including in grasslands. What we've learned is a diverse grassland with many different types of grasses and legumes and forbs actually helps to build soil, helps to feed the microbes in the soil, but underground, but also above ground. It's great for wildlife habitat and for animals and ruminants like we're grazing, that there's a direct correlation between the diversity in their diet and the nutrient density of their meat. The more diverse the diet, the more nutrient dense the meat results in. And that's encouraging. We get to watch that with our eyes. We get to see that. We kind of know that. But now we have the data to verify what we've seen with our own eyes.
You're involved in a study where they are testing the nutrient density of your products. Is that right?
Yes, we are. There's a big USDA study, Utah State, there's a number of universities involved with it, testing hundreds and hundreds of samples across different production methods. And then one of those groups of products is regeneratively raised grass-fed beef. So they're able to look at the complete makeup of that product. The technology exists now to really break it down to the hundreds of components that are in that product. And they have found that there is that correlation in science now that shows that grass-fed on a diverse diet, grazed, is actually more nutrient dense than, let's say, a feedlot-fed corn diet. So we were happy to learn that. Specifically, the omega-6 fatty acids come down to create a better ratio with the omega-3 fatty acids. And in our Western diet, we typically have way too much omega-6 fatty acids in our diet. So it's great. The product that came off my farm was a 2-to-1 ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3. And that's really unheard of in beef. And we were so happy to find that out.
That's so awesome. Let's talk a little bit about how what you're doing with the cattle is actually helping the birds. Talk about how you move the cattle every single day and why.
Yes, part of our practice is to move we have 2 herds we're moving. We move them every single day. And the real reason is we're first of all, we're mimicking what knows works. So the millions of bison that ran in this country for who knows, thousands of years, really built this topsoil that we have. And what they did was go in a tight herd and move around every day to, a fresh place to eat. It just made sense for them. And then over time, they would come back after the land had recovered and rested and graze that again. So that's the principle we're following. We give enough area, enough forage for the cattle for one day where they don't overgraze it, which is the most important thing, only taking the top third of the plant, leaving the bottom 2/3, trampling some of it, fertilizing it, of course, for that one day, and then moving them to another paddock, we call them, the next day. And then allowing that land to rest, which is the second most important component, to not overgraze it, but then to let it rest. Our rest period, it varies by eco-region, but in our region here, we rest about 55 days, and then that plant has the ability to fully express itself again.
Leave and cover for the birds from prey. You guys stay out of the nesting areas while the birds are nesting. And it seems to be working. You're noticing it with your own eyes. You're seeing more birds on the ranch. Is that right?
Yes, we are. We have noticed a comeback of a variety of different birds. Of course, it's easier to see the bigger birds, the wild turkeys, the bald eagles, the waterfowl. But there are some protected songbirds that are coming back as well that we have seen, and that the Audubon people are much better at spotting than I am. But they were really happy to see a couple of species that have resurfaced on our land to help them survive and propagate. But yes, that it's very important that rest period allows a lot of cover for those birds. And that is, except for the one day we're grazing, they have cover all the rest of the days that of the growing season.
And while this is more labor intensive and obviously more expensive, consumers are kind of waking up to where their food is coming from and making choices to buy from places just like yours. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's a mindset that changed, during the pandemic, where a lot of things were questioned, where a lot of things were coming from, but specifically around food, we've seen consumers asking more questions about what are our practices in raising our beef, what's in it, what's not in it. Like we don't do synthetic hormones, we don't do antibiotics, so that meat is as clean as possible. And that has continued on for the few years here, where that consumer interest is continuing to grow, continuing to look for options where they can feel comfortable that the beef, the food that they're eating reflects their values on what they think was important, and just asking those questions like where is it? And it turns out it truly is, we are what our food eats, and people are learning that, like, okay, who's the farmer? How are they raising these animals? And how is it going to affect me? And how is it going to affect the environment?
Well, we appreciate everything that you are doing. Matt Meyer at Thousand Hills Beef, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Up next, an avian oasis right in the heart of Minneapolis that you might not know about. And even if you don't consider yourself a bird lover, it is quite a sight to see. Finally, we leave you with the beautiful sights of a blue heron rookery right in the heart of Minneapolis. If you want to see it for yourself, you need to act fast.
Every spring, the great blue herons return and we'll reuse these habitats year after year. We call this a rookery. Great blue herons almost always show up in Minnesota on St. Patrick's Day. It's something that people have paid attention to and seems pretty reliable. They like to nest in groups because there's safety in groups. They show up and they start working on their nests almost immediately. As you can see, there are no leaves on the trees, so they're easy to see. The birds very intentionally select these areas that are out in islands surrounded by a river. Even though we're close by, they're not feeling threatened by us at all because they know we are not swimming across that river and climbing their trees to get to their nests. So yeah, they feel quite comfortable. They get their nests in order, they sort of rebond as a couple, and then they lay their eggs. Those eggs hatch, and then they're bringing food and feeding their chicks in the nest. Once those chicks are kind of big enough and have their feathers and can fly, they'll fly away from this nest by early summer. Results from our region show that great blue herons are declining, specifically in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we think that might be tied in part to the decline of some bottomland forests. But bottomland means forests that are flooded periodically in the spring when you get a spring flood. Great blue herons are here all spring, summer, and fall, but if you want to come and see them at the rookery, and if the best opportunity is to come and see them before the leaves are out on the trees, because that'll make it harder to see the birds. Be here in April and May, and those are the best opportunities to see them. But yeah, once we hit early to mid-June, these birds will be dispersed. They'll be all over the landscape. You'll see them at your local wetlands, but they won't be concentrated here at the rookery.
To get to the rookery, you just need to go to Marshall Terrace Park in northeast Minneapolis. Walk down toward the river and you will find a viewing platform to watch the birds in action. We have this information for you on KARE11.com. In fact, we have all of this information for you at KARE11.com. You can always catch up on the latest KARE 11 extras on the KARE 11 Plus app for your TV. Just go to the news menu at the top, then scroll down to extras. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.